Our next witness, Dr. al-Marayati, is that correct?
Yes.
Marayati. We welcome you so much to our hearing today, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you. I'm here to speak regarding Muslims and intolerance faced by Muslims in Europe today. I thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be here, because ours is a voice that has been noticeably absent from similar hearings that have been occurring lately. I will try to keep my remarks condensed, so I would ask that the text that I have submitted be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. In Islam, the significance and valuation for human rights and dignity can be found throughout the Quran, the Holy Scripture for Muslims, and throughout other religious texts. In matters of faith, the language is explicit and unequivocal. Quote, "There is no compulsion in religion. Truth stands out clear from error." Thus, the rights of Muslims and non-Muslims alike in expressions of faith are guaranteed not only in theory but in practice, as the Quran also states, "O you who believe, be ever steadfast in your devotion to God, bearing witness to the truth in all equity, and never let the hatred of others lead you into the sin of deviating from justice. Be just. This is the closest to being God-conscious. And remain conscious of God. Verily, God is aware of all that you do." Yet it is hatred and rage that is at the root of anti-Muslim sentiment and violence plaguing Europe today. The status of Muslims in Europe is precarious, for they represent a group that is viewed as alien, unacknowledged, or threatening throughout the region. Racist tendencies fueled by paranoia regarding Islamic revivalism have rendered Europe hostile, unresponsive to, and in violation of the human rights of Muslims. While Western leaders support newfound religious freedom in places like the former Soviet republics, which have allowed for some Christian revivalism, the same leaders fear the resurgence of Islam in those very countries, underscoring the bias of policymaking in Europe. In an interfaith meeting in Rome last summer with Father General Castelnick of the Jesuit Order of the Catholic Church, it was made clear that Europe has a problem with Islam. Indeed, the problem is the historical baggage carried by Europe with respect to the Middle East, dating back to the Crusades and then the Inquisition. The human rights violations suffered by Muslims in Europe range from police brutality and right-wing extremist attacks that often result in murder to confinement to the role of second-class citizen. When expedient, the card of fears of Islamic fundamentalism is used to justify persecution and discrimination, as Europe and her allies do not question such a characterization. While other religious groups are measured by the mainstream and not the extremists, Muslims are defined by the most extreme elements in their midst. For a clearer and more constructive U.S. policy in Europe, this double standard must end. The hatred of Muslims throughout Europe is well summarized in an article highlighting the findings this year of the Runnymede Commission in the United Kingdom, which examined the growing phenomenon of Islamophobia, known as dread or hatred of Muslims. While focusing on Great Britain, the findings can be applied anywhere anti-Muslim prejudice is expressed. The key features of Islamophobia include the portrayal of Muslim cultures as monolithic, intolerant of pluralism and dispute, patriarchal and misogynistic, fundamentalist and potentially threatening to other cultures. A further and particularly disturbing feature of Islamophobia is its apparent acceptability, as the expression of anti-Muslim ideas and sentiments is increasingly respectable. The acceptability and tolerance for anti-Muslim prejudice and hatred is allowing gross human rights violations to occur unchecked. Other groups who have been similarly suppressed in the past accept that Islam is largely a negative force and therefore condone, through their own silence, these atrocities. Reports regarding the persecution of Muslims are mainly gathered from human rights groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others. There is no broad-based Muslim organization which can document the extent of persecution and discrimination of Muslims in Europe. Many Muslims are unaware of the availability of these groups to advocate on their behalf, and also because some of the suppression is committed by those in authority, Muslims have a lack of trust of any system that claims to protect them, so we can only assume the extent of persecution of Muslims in Europe is vastly underreported. The most significant tragedy in Europe since the Holocaust was the genocide in the former Yugoslavia, where Bosnian Muslims were the victims of a widespread government-sponsored campaign of ethnic cleansing by Serbian armed forces and civilians. Neighboring European nations, as well as the United States, justified their inaction and lack of involvement by claiming that the conflict was motivated along ethnic lines, yet Serbian leaders such as Milosevic and Karadzic used anti-Islamic rhetoric to fan the flames of hatred that allowed 200,000 Bosnian Muslims to be killed, over 1 million expelled from their homes, 20,000 women raped, and countless more men, women, and children suffering from long-lasting physical and psychological trauma. At the time when the international community chose not to act, many felt that if the victims had been Christian or Jewish, then intervention would not have been delayed. Current focus on the persecution of Christians receiving support in Congress for a severe response to similar crimes lends credence to this view of a double standard for the protection of some religious minorities to the exclusion of others. This hypocrisy is further manifested by the lack of will on the part of the global community to take definitive action in bringing the indicted war criminals to justice. In the war in Chechnya, while both sides committed atrocities, Russian troops carried out a disproportionate amount of violence against non-combatants, including indiscriminate killings, extrajudicial executions of civilians, torture, rape, and hostage-taking. The main problem facing Muslims in many countries in Europe is police brutality, which includes assault, murder, harassment, intimidation, and other degrading treatment that qualifies as torture. This is particularly a problem in Germany, France, and to some extent in the United Kingdom. The depth and severity of police brutality is only slightly outdone by the atrocities committed by right-wing extremists. In Germany, the majority of victims are Turks and Kurds, usually refugees or asylum seekers. A pattern has emerged of ill treatment of foreigners. And some occasions, the police officers have continued the assault that was started by right-wing extremists. In other instances, the victims are not informed of the basis for their arrests. They are accused of being combative, thus justifying police brutality, and they are not given due process once detained. The officers who are prosecuted for the use of excessive force receive a punishment that is inadequate, and the victims' families do not receive adequate compensation. This also results in underreporting of the extent of the problem, as the victims fear retaliation and deportation and do not seek to highlight their problems. In France, similar reports of the use of excessive force by police officers against Muslim minorities, particularly from Northern Africa, include beatings, mass arrests of immigrants, and other forms of verbal and physical abuse. In addition, several detainees have been shot and killed in the back or in the back of the head while in police custody. In one egregious case, the officer received a lightened sentence, and the conviction was expunged from his criminal record, so he continues to serve and carry arms.
Could I ask, Doctor, if you could summarize your testimony and
Okay.
And if you could make your recommendations to the panel as well.
Okay. I'll just briefly go through some of the other problems. The hate crimes that exist in Germany, over 1,000 documented in the past 2 years. Now they are becoming more widespread in other countries throughout Europe, Netherlands, Switzerland, France, 500 hate crimes. The main problem also is the tolerance of these crimes by authority figures. We've already talked about citizenship. This will become a problem because many Muslim minorities are not allowed to become citizens in the countries where they have lived for years in our second and third generation families. They experience discrimination in employment, in the military, and in the education systems. The main issue has to do with repression due to fears of Islamic resurgence, which results in mass arrests in France and deportations, not allowing mosques to be built in the Czech Republic, opposing Muslim leaders in Uzbekistan, and also in Turkey, which has cracked down to an extreme nature on Muslim activism and Muslim education in the schools. Muslim women also suffer as specific targets because they will wear a head covering known as hijab, which singles them out. This became a significant problem in France, where girls who were wearing a head cover were not allowed to go to school. This meant some families preferred to keep their daughters home, and they did not get educated. They are discriminated from in Turkey. They are not allowed to continue their education or advance in the workplace because it is felt to be a sign of excessive religiosity. Human rights groups have not focused specifically on the problems faced by Muslim women who, compared to their male counterparts, may be likely to report harassment, intimidation, and discrimination. These problems are the result of deep-heated rage and prejudice that must be addressed. It's also contributed to a large extent, by the media, which continues to present images in a very negative light of Islam and Muslims. This happens on our own country, where movies like Executive Decision, True Lies, and recently G.I. Jane that are broadcast around the world that perpetuate these stereotypes. Therefore, our main recommendations have to do with making sure that the member states of OACE uphold the principles to which they have signed on international human rights documents, that they develop educational programs on all levels of their country as these atrocities begin from the top and work their way down, They need to be accountable for human rights violations of all types, not only focusing on religious persecution. And we must ensure that Europe is not exempted from the Freedom of Religious Persecution Act if it is passed, simply because of our own cultural identification with Eurocentrism. And finally, we will ask the media to recognize its contribution to the problem and take a more even-handed approach without relying on stereotypes to generate a profit or create alarm, and focus more on accurate portrayals of Muslims and other minorities to develop programs of a positive nature that can actually combat racism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, very much.